Beginning in verse 6. Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. Now, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to an idol is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. But not all things, edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Now eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's, and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the bread over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. Paul has shown that many at Corinth were not running well. Many had fallen back in a lot of different ways. And in this chapter here, he continues to argue that once a Christian is saved, does not mean that they are always saved. And so he refers back. He says, now I don't want you to be ignorant of what happened to God's people, see, under the old covenant. God preserved these things for this very reason, see, to admonish us not to fall into the various lusts and temptations that they did. And he points out some of these specific lust. They lusted for a god. And in particular, he says now, these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. See, so they lusted for evil things out there in the wilderness. And the point being, God killed them for it. Now, I can't say that any stronger than to just look back. And God, we should be grateful, one, that we're under this better covenant. I don't know where we'd be. Where would you be? Where would I be? See, if he was hands-on in many instances where you violated his law and the death sentence, see, was given. And as happened to them out in the wilderness, the destroyer, see, there was a traveling angel with them. And God warned, see, that he has the name of God in him. And he's not even like me in that he will kill you. See, and he will not relent. And I think many times when we read these expressions that Moses is talking to God and things along these lines, I believe that he's talking to this angel or a representative of God in most of those cases. And we see this Moses arguing, reminding God of his people and his covenant. When they'd get to where they were complaining, and God would say, well, I'm just going to kill them all, Moses. We'll start over with you. See? And Moses would be reminding God of his promises with those of old. That, no, you said you'd bring these people into this land, and if you don't do it, Moses is arguing with God that you would, the Egyptians and people will know you brought them out here just to kill them. So you can't keep your word. You swore and promised that you would deliver them into this land. And so if you kill them all, you'd be going back, God, on your promises. And so they were guilty out there of idolatry. He says, now the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. You find that in verse 7. Now, I believe that is where they were worshiping the golden calf. And this verse I pointed out last week is significant. I believe that this will help us understand what he will talk here in subsequent verses, because what came down out there on this occasion was that when they made the golden calf, that Aaron, said, proclaimed a feast to the Lord, he said. And then the next verse says, and the people rose up early, see, and they began to worship these idols. And it says, and they sat down, see, they had a feast. They sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And I believe these expressions is referring to the fact that they had wholesale given themselves over to idolatry, because what they had done is eaten a feast to demons, to devils. And we need to be careful that we don't fall into these same type things. Now, I know it may be hard to imagine, but we can. And I'd imagine it'd be hard to imagine, see, somebody getting off and worshiping an idol out in their backyard. But we can take heed. He would say, let him who thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Now, all of it would be for the Chinese to run this country. Now, they're an abominable people, a wicked, devilish, idolatrous people. And if we were enslaved and they put pressure on us to worship their gods, to bow before their gods, can you see how it wouldn't take long before some would become susceptible to bowing down and worshiping things that they probably in their wildest dreams would never imagine. But it can happen. It is happening, it can happen, and we need to be careful, like Paul is saying. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. They committed fornication out there. Fornication is running rampant in the church today via divorce and remarriage. See, it's rampant. People in second, third marriages, married to people sleeping with other men's wives, and things along these lines. So let us not think now that this gravest sin that they committed out there, and I believe now when they committed it, it's referring to probably when they got out there and they worshiped the Moabite gods. Now they were afraid. The 10 spies had given an evil report, and they got out there and they didn't want to cross over, and they started complaining and whining, and then the people seduced them, is how it's looked at. The people convinced them, y'all come over here and worship with us. See, and they fell for that temptation. And when they got over there, they had fornication, committed fornication with the Midianite women. And you might remember Phineas stepped up to the plate and killed one of them in a very gross fashion. That pleased God, incidentally. And then he staved off all of them getting killed that day. God was really angry, and they would have been gone had Phineas not intervened, and God said such. So we can become susceptible to idolatry, fornication, complaining, and things that they did out in the wilderness. But then he transitions, he reminds them that now these things became our examples, and they were written to admonish us. So God preserved them. Thank goodness that we can remember that our God is a consuming fire. Have you forgotten that our God is a consuming fire? See, that we need these examples to remind us, admonish us, because we can forget that sometimes. See, we're a couple of thousand years in, not quite 2,000. The church was come into existence approximately AD 33. We 2021, and so we're not quite at 2,000, but look, we removed, aren't we, to the age of spiritual gifts. See, now, Ananias and Sapphira walked into an assembly and never walked out. See, that's what we have to remember, is when you pillying around with your giving, or you and I think we can get off and commit fornication or do something. Now, we need to remember who we're dealing with. See, and in the first century, they had reminders of that. We need these reminders here too. See, they were written to admonish us. See, don't become fornicators like some of them. And then he says what he had been building to say, and that is that you can fall. We need to take heed, be careful. And again, as we pointed out, we've heard whole lessons on 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I have one in verse 12. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And so the Christian can fall. Christians do fall. Christians have fallen. We need to take heed that we don't fall. Look back when you can and look at what happened to them, because they, like us, were baptized. They were saved from the devils in those Egyptians, wicked people. I mean wicked people. Now, they claimed they wanted to go back there. Dave and I talked about this some after the lesson last week. Now, these are people that had killed their babies. Had they forgotten who they were dealing with? This man, some of them kings did not deal kindly with them. These were wicked, evil people. Had sent out a decree to kill all the little boys. See, Moses just by God's providence escaped, you see. But a lot of babies did not survive that massacre. See, but they want to go back. See, they lusted after evil things, after the great God of heaven had saved them. Now, what about us? See, after having been saved, do we watch pornography? We still lusting after evil things? What about our friend? We go back. We want to be back with the Egyptians. You longing to be with your buddies that you used to run with. See, lusting after evil things. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And Paul explains that God is faithful now. What happened to the Egyptians out there, they did not have to succumb to those temptations, because really he points out that God is faithful, that with every temptation, what he does is provides a way of escape. Now, we may think that what we're going through is extraordinary when we're being tempted to sin, but it is not. There's nothing extraordinary about it. And we might be reminded that it doesn't matter whether you're at Corinth. History tells us that Corinth was an evil place. Now, that might have been so, I imagine so, but whether it was or not, fornication is fornication. I know that. That you can commit it here in Albertville, you can commit it in New York City, you can commit it in San Francisco. It is what it is. And this right here says, let us, Paul included himself, and he included that this letter was written to the church at Corinth and to all in every place who call on the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, both theirs and ours. He's all of our Lord's. These instructions are for us. It don't matter where you at, how wicked the city, that whatever we face, and I take these temptations to be sinful temptations, not the kind that God put before Abraham, not the kind that he put before Israel. Now, that wilderness was a test. We could read those verses if somebody needed us to, but God tested them out there in the wilderness. See, they got a little thirsty. You go out there and you're a few days, and now all of a sudden it's been 3 days. They said, and we out of water. Now we got a problem, they said. See, and this is where dads should say, now look, y'all be quiet. Let's wait on the Lord. See, let's remember where we come from. See, and this is where moms would say, look, you be quiet now. Yeah, I know we're thirsty, and we got water coming. The Lord knows we need water. See, that's how it works. Now, that's the way of escape. Take it. See, that's how it works. And no matter what we face or whatever is in front of us, God is faithful. And he's not going to allow us to go through something that the devil puts out here in front of us that we can't help it. And then he's been building, I believe, although all these sins are going on, but it seems that they had an issue, were susceptible to worshiping idols. Whatever was going on, we know he had regulated their eating in chapter 8, because some with consciousness were still eating, see, with consciousness of the idol. Now they were being tripped up, and he warned those with knowledge how to behave toward the weak as it related to these things, he says, offered to idols. And then here in this chapter, he brings that up again about idolatry, but from an entirely different perspective, because here, what he's fixing to show is how horrible it is to get caught up in worshiping demons and things along those lines. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Now that verse says, the famous verse, no temptation has overtaken you. See, if something overtakes us, it's because we didn't take the way of escape. How do I know that? Because this verse says God is faithful and will not allow us to be tempted, see, beyond what we are able. So we are always able, see, to not practice fornication. You're always able not to practice idolatry. You and I are always able, see, not to complain. You're tempted to complain. The elders have made a decision. Now, you don't like it. You think it ought to be, boy, you smarter than them. Well, let me remind you. Now, that's what Korah thought. See, he had wanted, and not just him, the leaders, the leaders of the children of Israel wanted authority that they had not been given. They wanted Moses' authority. And they complained and whined. See? And threatened to overthrow. See? And that's what that's like. See? Now, but how can you avoid that? When Mike and they make a decision that affects us, can you avoid complaining about it? You sure can. Remember this lesson this morning. I'm telling you, do not complain. Paul said, do not complain, as some of them complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. See? Because that's what really would happen to us if we were living in those ages. God didn't take kindly to complainers. And Israel ruined their longevity by such. Everybody that was 20 years and above died out in the wilderness. Well, that's what verse 6 says, see? But with most of them, God was not well pleased, see? And they fell. He scattered them in the wilderness, scattered their bodies in the wilderness, verse 6 says. Now, Paul says, I'm going to talk to you. Now, he could not, when he was working with them, talk to them as unto wise. He says they were still carnal. But here he says, I speak as to wise men. Now, I want y'all to examine what I'm about to teach on idolatry. He had just warned, flee idolatry. Now, what do you mean, Paul? Who's involved in idolatry? Well, he says, now you take the Lord's Supper, the cup of blessings, he says, which we bless. And I take this to be the Lord's Supper. I don't know of another cup that we bless. I don't know of another cup that Christians bless. I don't know of a cup that we take together. And I don't know of another cup where we are sharing in the body and blood of Christ. I believe this to be the Lord's Supper. But he says the cup of blessings which we bless, is it not the sharing or the communion of the blood of Christ? And it is. When we break bread, what we do, Jesus says, now take and eat. Say, take and drink. This is my body. This is my blood. See, so we're sharing in that together. See, the cup of blessings which we bless, we offer thanks, we bless it. And then we share in it because we take it together. Now, what are we sharing in? Now, if I take that and drink it at the house, we ain't sharing in nothing, just good old-fashioned grape juice. But now sitting right here, you know what we're sharing in? The blood of Christ. It's an act of worship to God. And we're partaking of this table. See, this table. This is the Lord's table. Now, I don't mean a literal, physical table. We could be sitting down on the floor for all he cares. See? But because he hadn't told us what to set it up on is my point. But be that as it may, when we take it, now, so he says, now take that principle. And in that, am I trying to argue? And this is what he means when he says, now, observe Israel after the flesh are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar. What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to an idol is anything? And so Paul is saying, now, when I tell you that when we share in the Lord's Supper, when we eat the bread, we're partaking of his body. Well, Paul is saying, okay, now, so am I arguing that an idol is something? So he had said, flee from idolatry. When I make this case, judge what I'm saying. He says, when we do this, am I arguing that an idol is something, or that the things that are offered to an idol is something? Does that make the food something? It does not. What makes it idolatry is when you do what Israel did. Aaron said, tomorrow we're going to make a feast to the Lord, and the people got up. They rose up. And the people, they sat down to eat and drink, see, to these idols. The people sat down and eat and drink and rose up to play is an expression that means that they got out there and they ate the feast, they worshiped an idol. And so he says, when I show you now this principle of being a partaker, observe Israel after the flesh. Now, a lot of the Passover meal, some of the offerings were eaten. The blood and the fat went up to God. They'd kill an animal, sprinkle the blood around the altar, and the fat, they'd burn it and offer it up as a sweet smelling aroma to God. Now, the leftover meat, see, here's the shamble, what's sold in the shambles we'll discuss here. But anyway, this leftover meat, some of it was holy in that the priest, the men at times, were allowed to eat this meat in a holy place on a holy day. Now, see, when they did that, that's worship to God. That food, now, is an idol anything? Food anything? Is this grape juice anything? Is the unleavened bread anything? No, not in that sense, but it is when we come together and worship God with it. See, we're partakers of the altar. See, and so he said, observe Israel after the flesh. See, not those who eat of the sacrifices. See, he's not talking about meat that's sold in the shambles. That's not partaking of the altar. Partaking of the altar is when that meal is in worship to the idol. See, that's what makes it sinful. And so Paul is not going back on his word and all the instructions that's found throughout the Bible by teaching that meat that is offered to an idol is somehow wrong. It is not. Because really what he points out, he says, let me tell you what I really have been talking about. And he says, now what am I saying then, that an idol is anything? Or what is offered to an idol is anything? He said, no. Rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to God. No. Wouldn't be nothing wrong with that. The things that the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with the demons. See, so it's sinful to worship, to have feast offered to idols. That's idolatry. And these Christians here needed to be well warned. Evidently, there were issues. This keeps coming up over and over, these idols and how to behave as it related to them. And so when he says you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons, it's not that you can't try, because that's what they tried out in the wilderness. But that's idolatry. If you get up early in the morning and you offer up, you have a feast up to idol, that's idolatry. And it'd be idolatrous for us to do the same thing too. All we are allowed to worship is God. See, we know that there's one God, he pointed out in chapter 8. There's only one God. Now, we know that an idol is nothing. We know that what is offered to an idol is nothing. And he's teaching that same thing here. It is not the food. It is when you offer it in worship. Because that's what they did out there in the wilderness, is they worshiped the idol. There's nothing wrong with eating meat that is offered to an idol. He had taught in chapter 8, meat does not commend us to God. It don't matter whether we eat, are we the better, or if we don't eat, are we the worse, he says. See? But there was a general command, and this really helps, I believe, nail down. In Acts chapter 15, he had talked about when they were having issues with these teachers among the Jews that were trying to bind the old covenant on them. The apostles had to get together and come up with some advice, some decrees for the Gentile people. And here's what he come up with. And they told them in verse 29, a part of this letter said that you abstain from things offered to idol. Wait a minute. Abstain from things offered to an idol. Well, here in this chapter, you know what Paul is teaching? It's okay to eat things offered to an idol. So what this tells me is back here in chapter 15 of Acts is that expression, abstain from things offered to an idol, that's in worship to an idol. It must be. It absolutely must be that. Otherwise, we got a big, bad contradiction where you have the Spirit in one place saying you can't eat things offered to an idol. And then over here, 2 or 3 times, he says it's okay to eat these things. So Paul would go on and say, are we going to provoke God to jealousy? And we could take time and read those passages, but our God is a jealous God. And you go back and you read in Exodus chapter 20 when he gave the 10 Commandment law, that first law, now I am a jealous God. You shall have no gods before me. And I believe this is the statement that he's referring to when he says simply, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Now that's interesting to me. See, we still can do that. See, Paul says, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? And that's what we would do if we turn to these kind of little acts of worship and things. See? So you and I, let's stay on top of our hearts. Always stay locked in on our worship services and things. See, don't let this become just a mindless thing that we do, because you'd be headed toward idolatry. You'd be done took a step toward from the holy to the unholy. See, this just becomes just something we do. You're just sitting there and you're just taking, you look up and you don't even realize, this do in remembrance of me. Or you eat it not discerning the Lord's body. See, which we, Lord willing, would discuss in chapter 7. See, that when we eat this needs to be a conscientious effort. Jesus says, take, eat. This is what? See, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. See, and so this can't become mindless. That'd be the first step, wouldn't it? Is turning from God. That's what they did out there. They got out there in the wilderness and they couldn't see God. Now they could. There was evidence of it. Smoke was going everywhere. Like you could see that we in the presence of the holy, of the supernatural. And yet they got out there and said, this Moses is delayed. Make us a God. Make us a God to go before us. See. Just what? Just 40, just take a few days for you to forget about God? It can happen. It can happen. That's why I'm scared for these people that hadn't been meeting all this time. Now, they might think they can turn that switch back on, but you can't turn it back on. And I'm curious what that will look like down the road, all these churches that hadn't met in over a year. I know several of them. I'm studying with people every week from those places. And I'm telling you, I don't know what they're going to do. Can you turn it on and off? Can you turn it on and off like that? Well, they fixing to see. You cannot. And so Paul then goes on and he begins to show what he has shown throughout this whole book is that we need to do whatever we have to do to save ourselves and to save others. He has used this expression, all things are lawful for me, but not all things edify, earlier. And he uses it here again. Now, earlier in chapter 6, he said, all things are lawful, but all things edify not. All things are lawful, but I won't be brought under the power of any. See, there he uses this expression and he shows that he won't become enslaved. Even though something might be right, he's not going to let it control him. Here he uses this expression, all things are lawful, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful, he says, but all things edify not. And so whenever we would eat these, they would go and eat this meat into shambles. They needed to be very careful. Whenever they were invited to dinner and eating with those that were non-Christians, unbelievers, they needed to be careful. And Paul would point this out here. And in the balance, he illustrates, I believe in verse 23 through 33, where he just simply illustrates that it's okay if you get invited over to a meal by an unbeliever. Now, he may be an idolatrous person. He may practice idolatry. And if they invite you, you want to go, that's okay. And whatever. Now, here was the instructions, though. One caveat. It's okay to go. But he says this now, if they invite you over And what you do, if they say, look, here's some meat that was sold into shambles, just go ahead and eat it. He said, that'd be fine. But if they say, now this meat was offered to an idol, he says, now look, in this situation, I don't want you to eat that meat. Now, not because it's wrong to eat the meat, but because what we want to do is try to save people. This is clearly what he's teaching here. And so we're not going to eat this meat because of their conscience. See, we don't want them to violate their conscience. Not yours. I'm not talking about your conscience. And this is all the way down through there. I want you, if somebody said, now it might be 10 of us at a meal. And it ain't got to be the dad. It ain't got to be the mom. Maybe she's fixing and she says, now, by the way, Dub, this meat was offered to an idol. Don't eat it, Dub. That's what he's saying. Now, but if they say, well, look at here. Now, this meat here, we bought this meat here in the shambles. He said, just eat. Don't ask no questions. Where'd this meat come from? See, because that too would conjure up an issue with their conscience. So the question he's raising here is what we want to do is always act and conduct ourselves in a way that's beneficial to others. Now, he had said this in chapter 8. This was a weak Christian. But here in this chapter, he shifts to unbelievers. Now, that's the full spectrum of it. This expression, all things are lawful, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful, but all things edify not. That's for Christians and non-Christians. Now, that's the entirety of God's Word. Now, you could focus solely on all those passages that just deal with him dealing with Christians, walking in front of weak Christians. See, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 or Romans chapter 14, Christians. Here is the entirety of God's Word. Now, this expression, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, I believe here is referring to the people. Now, I spent about 2 days looking at that expression, and I'm convinced 100% that that's what's under consideration here. You can go and carefully look at it. Now, it sounds like it's talking about everything is God's, it's okay to eat this meat. But I don't think that's what it's talking about. You go back and you really study that word, you'll see that it's used many times to be talking about everybody belongs to God. And I think that's the context here, see, is that we walk in love toward even unbelievers, because he's clearly talking about their conscience, not ours, because he says, and if any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is offered to idols, Dub, do not eat it. For the sake of the one who told you. For whose sake? For yours? No, the one who told you. Your conscience, and for conscience sake. But look at what he says. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. They belong to God too. That's what he's saying. We need to walk in love toward Christians and non-Christians. Now, it is true that everything belongs to God, but that ain't what he's talking about here, I don't believe. I believe he's talking about the people. He's emphasizing the people, their conscience, the people. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. See, everything belongs to God. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? And if I offer thanks, why am I evil spoken of, or the food over which I give thanks? Because the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Those people's souls are important, just like yours, just like your Christian brothers, and we need to walk in love toward them also. So it's okay to go and eat with them, but if they say this was offered to an idol, don't eat it, because we don't want to harm their consciences. It's what he's clearly teaching. Now, we'll circle back, Lord willing, next week, answer any questions, any objections, or any things that you'd like to discuss. Thank you for your time. Shane, we got in there, Brandy, Shane, and somebody else in the audience. We appreciate y'all.